Yeah, I think that's in 1 Corinthians 9 where he talks about other churches were supporting him. Or no, you're right, it's in 2 Corinthians 10, I think it is, where he robbed other churches because he did not take money from the Corinthian church, but he was taking money from other churches. That would have implied they were pooling money together. Good, that's one good passage for that. Any other passages you guys can think of for this?
1 Corinthians 16 says that there be no collections when he comes. So the idea is that there must have been some pooling or some treasury of money.
Yes.
So that it would be all of a sudden we got to get this money.
Good. 1 Corinthians 16. We'll look at that passage in a little bit too. Ian? Yes. Yeah. Acts 4, 34 to 35, there was not a needy person among them, for as many as were owners of lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold and laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need. Is that a treasury? Laying these resources at the apostles' feet, who are then kind of functioning like elders in a sense, by deciding where these funds go. Or another passage is Philippians 4, 14 and 15, when Paul talks about how the Philippian church was helping Paul financially with his preaching and teaching. Yet it was kind of you to share my trouble, and you Philippians yourselves know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving except you only. So this church was giving to Paul financially, which assumes that they had a collection of money that they were setting aside for some of these things. So those are some passages that you could go to show that. Do you guys want to say anything just about whether or not a church even has the right to pool money together? I think that's pretty straightforward, but I've heard some people try to argue that there's no authority for it and you just haven't read your Bible. All right. Notice this next question then. How was money added to the treasury in the Bible? And Wes brought up 1 Corinthians, so I'll go ahead and just read this. Now concerning the collection for the saints, by the way, have you ever noticed the chapter division here? Now concerning the collection of the saints, what was it that Paul just talked about in 1 Corinthians 15? The resurrection. And then the famous verse in verse 58, be steadfast, immovable, always working in the Lord, knowing that your work in the Lord is not in vain. Now concerning the collection of the saints. Have you ever noticed that? He just talks about these great truths of the resurrection, and then he gets to one of the things that you do that's not in vain, and that is this collection, which is for a particular purpose. But he says, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so also are you to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as you may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. All right, how is this church going to add to their treasury, which in this context is for a particular need of needy Christians that we'll talk more about in just a moment. But what was the method of them adding money to the treasury? Yeah, once a week they laid something aside. Free will offerings of people. 2 Corinthians 8, 1 through 4, we want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia, for in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part, for they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And just, this is talking about other Christians that were in other churches that are begging to be able to participate in this. It's the free will offerings of Christians is what we see in the Bible as how people were adding to the treasury. So this question then, what are some examples of how churches may add to their treasury today that do not fit the pattern that we see in the New Testament? Bake sales, what? Fish fry? Yeah. What else? Spaghetti dinner? Yeah, cookies. We haven't had cookies yet. When we lived in Nashville, in the county that we lived in, churches by law code had to have steeples. And so one of the things that a lot of these churches started doing in this area, because it was like booming and all this stuff, is cell phone companies would go to some of these people that ran these churches and said, hey, can we take your steeple and convert it into a cell phone tower? And you guys will get about $2,000 a month by doing that. What do you think about that? Okay, great. In one sense, yeah, great opportunity. Would I have a problem with it, Ian?
Considering that the cell tower was not available to them back then, I don't know what the equivalent could be if someone came up and said, hey, could we do this and work for you?
Yeah, well, let me throw out a couple scenarios. There's one church that I knew of that was in a downtown area that a lot of buildings had been built around it, and when it was originally built, it wasn't as busy, and it was an area that people paid for parking. And so this church decided that they were going to rent out their parking lot spaces during the week, and the church generated, I think it was around $3,000 a month doing that. There's another church that I know of that their building was along a major freeway, highway, interstate, and there was a company that came to them saying, we'll give you $150,000 a year if we can put a billboard on your property. So what about these scenarios? Yeah.
I've lived with this for a long time. What if the church did not own a building? But let's say this building was owned by David.
And we rented it from David.
And we rented the building for $1 a month.
Mm-hmm.
But we didn't own the building. Could David have a billboard or a cell tower? Yes. So, we're conflicting about choices. But the idea of building a $1 million building and use it 4 hours a week makes absolutely no sense at all. Now, if let some wealthy brother buy and pay for the building and rent it from him for 4 hours a week for whatever amount. So, we get so conflicted about the building and how it's used, but there's multiple alternatives to the paradigm that we find ourselves in.
Right, and the question is, would this be an authorized way that a treasury could be accumulated? Amy?
It would go against my conscience. And the reason being so is that the church is not in business to make money.
Right.
The church is in business to save souls, to worship God, to praise God. Now, as a frugal person, can I put a steeple on my house and somebody pay me to put a cell tower in it? Man, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, I wouldn't. Yeah, go for it.
So looking at that, because we're all physical beings, there's all physical pulls in our logic, right? Because, hey, let's make the church money without doing anything.
Right.
But what is our goal? If they're going to put a billboard, right, what's going to be on that billboard?
And that was the church that decided we're not going to let the billboard be on our property because they would have no control over what's on the billboard. And there was other reasons why, and I think it came down to also, this is not any way in the Bible that people added to their treasury. Yeah.
Well, that's what I was going to say, Eric. We just read 2 examples of how they added to the treasury, and neither of them said they were selling things as a group.
Right.
They were individually giving what they had. They weren't selling things as a group to make money.
Yes.
So we need to go by the examples that we have in the message that God gave us.
Right. Yeah, so I don't think that we should be on board with steeples, cell phone towers, billboards, all that sort of thing. And there can be all kinds of discussions on the use of the money to buy a church building, and we're using it 4 hours a week. Are there other ways we can utilize it? Those are good discussions to have, but I think it would be outside of what we're talking about right now. Yeah.
Money has to be given from our own. There's been plenty of examples like that, but it has to be a sacrifice. It can't just come from nothing.
Right.
It has to be given, not attained.
Yeah. Good. Good. Anything else on this one? Yeah.
So let me throw this out then, because if who's getting paid in these scenarios?
Oh, the preacher.
Okay. So if the preacher decides then, if it's been agreed upon, if the preacher decides to give that to the church, is that not acceptable? To the treasury? Is that acceptable?
Oh, yeah, that'd be starting to loophole. So when you have to start thinking about like technical loopholes and all these sorts of things, I think a good general rule of thumb is, okay, this is not, we don't see any example in Scripture of adding to the treasury by any other means other than the free will offerings of Christians. If people wanted to start to argue technicalities and getting around certain loopholes and stuff, do you think you're going to escape somebody in the congregation not having any conscientious problems about it? So what would love do? If somebody in the congregation said, look, I don't see any example of this in Scripture. I don't think this is an authorized way for us at all to be adding to our treasury, because the Bible says this is how we do it. And there was a collection of people that were conscientiously opposed to it. What would love do in that situation? They would say, don't do it. And so even if you could try to prove all of this stuff and get through all these technical loopholes and all of this sort of thing, I think one of the things that needs to control the way we think about this is love and what would make for peace. But beyond that, I don't think that you can show where this would be okay anyways. Any other thoughts or comments on that? All right. So if that is the collection of the treasury, it's free will things of the Christians. All right, so the question then becomes, how in the Bible is the treasury used? And there's a couple categories of this. Number one are needy Christians. And I think these are all the examples in the Bible. Besides the second category. I think these are all the examples in the Bible of when collections were made in the New Testament and where the money was going. So you have all who believed in Acts 2:44 and 45. You have those who believed in Acts 4. We read that just a little bit ago. They say in Acts 11 to send relief to the brothers. And in Romans 15:24, bringing aid to the saints. In Romans 15:26, the poor among the saints. 1 Corinthians 16:1, the collection for the saints. 2 Corinthians 8, when he talks about in 8 and 9, taking this collection, the same one that he talks about in 1 Corinthians 16, that it's support for the saints. And so in all of these passages, and then there's also the godly widows who would obviously also be Christians. All right, I'll just throw that out there first. Let me just see when it would be a good time to ask the question. Yeah, I'm going to wait for that. Do you guys have any comments, though, just on the example of how the church treasury is spent? Category number one is needy Christians. Comments or questions on that?
It's the family's responsibility first to support the needy member group. Maybe they don't have a family member, so that would come in, but the responsibility was like son or daughter,
Right.
brother or sister or anything. They're the first people should be their responsibility to take care of it.
Yes. Yep, good. Anything else? Yeah, Amy? Yes. Now, when Paul says in 1 Corinthians 16, when he says, collect this money so that there will be no collection when I come, so if they were collecting money for a particular purpose, to send money to the needy Christians in Jerusalem, were they still going to do a collection every first day of the week? Because he says, I don't want any scrambled collections having to happen when I come. After Paul came and collected that money, would that church have still had a collection every Sunday, do you think? We don't know. The question would be, were there things that church was doing collectively with their money that would have needed continual support? And so if there are things that they need to continually support, would it make sense to continually have a collection?
We support preachers around the world.
Right, so we have need to continually collect because we have continual needs. All right, so that's the first category, our needy Christians. The second category are preachers, which is the same thing as a needy Christian, but not technically. So Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9:14, in the same way the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. Galatians 6:6, let the one who is taught the word share all good things with the one who teaches. So preachers can be paid. They should be paid so that they have the time during the week to study and to have Bible classes with people. Yes, that's the next one here. This is what's not done as often. 1 Timothy 5:17 and 18, let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle the ox when it treads out the grain, and the laborer deserves his wages. I remember one time when I had no idea what this passage was saying, and I was a new Christian in an auditorium class, and I was sitting there trying to understand the passage, and the teacher said, all right, what does it mean to have double honor? And there was a smart aleck guy in the church who raised his hand, and he said, well, it's honor that's rendered twice. And everybody just kind of like sighed and like, that does not help us, Rob. What is double honor here in verse 17? Yeah, he's talking about paying. There's some elders that can be paid. And I think it would be good for some churches to have a paid elder. And it's the ones who are especially involved in preaching and teaching, which would imply that there are maybe some elders that don't do as much public preaching and teaching. But would it be wrong for a church to say have a fully supported evangelist and a fully supported elder at the same time? There's no problem with that. But it would have to be one that's especially engaged in teaching and preaching. Yeah. Yeah, so who would make that decision? I think if the congregation's got a lot of trust in the guy and they know that he's got the talent and the abilities to be focused on preaching and teaching, like this text says, and it's kind of the congregation would all be on board with this guy because we trust his leadership and, that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, I would like to think that it would be like a mutually agreed upon thing. Yeah.
Well, I can understand the idea of a paid elder. I think we have to be careful with that idea because there is going to be money divides. And so if only one elder is getting paid and then the others are getting paid, then what's to stop those other elders from thinking, I do work too, why am I not getting paid?
Right, and I think, there'd be things that you'd have to work through with all of that, but I think that's why he says, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. And then the same passage that Paul uses to describe how preachers should get paid, he applies to elders there. So can you be a preacher and become an elder? Sure. Are there potential problems with that? Yeah, there's potential problems with that. Can you be an elder already who then starts preaching and teaching more, and then your time gets so used up with that it makes sense to support the guy? That can happen too. So any comments or questions on the support of needy Christians and preachers? Because there's going to be a couple follow-up questions. If this is how we see the money being used, there's two follow-up questions that we need to ask that involves the potential for divisive conversation. So is everybody ready for that? All right, cool. So here's the first question. If there's no example of churches buying a building, why would it be assumed we could spend money on a building, projectors, hymn books, carpet? Like what? Why would we make that conclusion then if the only thing that the Bible shows the collection being used for are needy Christians and preachers and some elders? Why can we do this? What are your thoughts?
Expediency.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
It helps teach the word.
Yep.
You can get by with a chalkboard or a whiteboard or anything, but a projector is more expedient for people to see. I mean, it's a vague word, but
So it helps us do something that God has told us to do?
correct.
Yeah, okay, good. What else would we say about this, Amy? Right. So how about this? We're commanded, well, no, we're not. We have the example of taking the Lord's Supper, right? We're commanded to take it, like in 1 Corinthians 11, like to take it in a certain way. So we are commanded to take the Lord's Supper. The example is on first day of the week. So we're supposed to take the Lord's Supper. So does that mean that somebody's got to spend money on the little crackers and the grape juice? So does that command require the expense of the purchase of resources? It requires that. And so if that's one of the collective activities that God has asked us to do when we come together, would it make sense to use the church treasury money for that? And if we're also commanded to meet, and nobody's home can facilitate the size church that we have, would we have the authority by that line of reasoning to buy a building that would allow us to fulfill a command that God has asked us to do? And so I agree with that idea. I believe that. I think that all makes sense. Does anybody have any comments or questions on that? Yeah.
So where do we get a lot of resources and like conveniences? Because we have air conditioning and we have heating and we have all of these nice views and all that decorative stuff up there. So how do we decide what's a resource and what's just a convenience?
Yeah. So that's a good question. Yeah, LR, please.
All right. We do see them renting a building, correct me if I'm wrong, it was a school building, in the early days of the church. Of course, in Acts 20, verse 7, they're meeting.
The Hall of Tyrannus.
Sorry.
Are you talking about the Hall of Tyrannus in Acts 19?
Right. So they're doing that. They're using a facility of a building. In modern day United States, if we're going to have a building, there's different codes and laws in the city that says if you have a building and so many people will be in that building, you have to provide a form of heat and air. They got to have ventilation. And you have to have the fire code, and it has to have all these different codes to it. We also see in Acts chapter 20 that they were meeting at night, so they had to have light. That means a little bit.
They had candles in Acts 20.
Right. And so they had that. So these things are inferred, but we do have laws that say also that you have to have seating.
So many parking spots.
And also you have to have drainage of the area.
Yeah.
So there are laws pertaining to that. We're supposed to obey the law as long as it doesn't go against the Word of God. And I'm paraphrasing that. And so that's where we get those things. It's a good question. Why not just meet under a tree? Well, in wintertime, it's kind of cold to be under a tree. And not all, a lot of people
Yeah.
can't stand it. But we have a building, and since we're meeting and we're X number of people, we have to heat cool that building by so many laws.
Yeah. Good. Any other thoughts to Madeline's great question? Yeah, Madeline.
What about, because I know like other churches of Christ have buses. Like, what's the opinion on buses that bring people to services or like pick non-Christians up from services? What's the thought on that?
Do you have a thought on that? Yeah. Yeah. Now, my preference would be that individuals would just be picking people up that they could, and that like there was the church in Minnesota. There was a woman at the church that was handicapped, and she needed a special bus to be able to get to the church building. And the church there did buy a little bus that had like a lift on it for her in that situation. And she was a member of the church and all that kind of stuff, and nobody threw a fit about that. But I think the kind of thing that you're bringing up is kind of like almost an evangelistic tool, perhaps, where it's like we should be individually inviting people and maybe bringing people. Those would be some of the sacrifices that we perhaps should be making. Yeah.
There's a lot that goes into when you have a bus because you have liability.
Sure.
And are you paying someone to pick them up versus us doing it? So are you paying somebody to do your Christian duty, right? Am I going to pay somebody to do something that I should be doing myself?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So when we start talking about things like buses or anything like fellowship halls,
Yeah.
one of the great things I think is the autonomy of churches. If that church body wants to do that, I have no problem. We choose not to do that. I'm perfectly fine with that too. Where my feathers get ruffled is when we start taking these clearly subjective lines that we have drawn and applying them very sternly
Okay. All right. Any,
It's the Lord's money, you gotta be frugal with it, you can't be frivolous, say, oh, you know, every 5 years you get 4K projectors and this kind of thing. It, you know, there was a big, where we came from, we went from a board to a projector, and people, we, you know, took a year to make the decision to spend the extra funds.
yeah.
Or you wouldn't want to buy a $40,000, $50,000 vehicle and have it sit in the park lot most of the week. You know, I mean, I'm not saying it's not needed, but you're right, you got, it's not really expenses like a business. It's the Lord, and it has to be weighed with the
Right.
frugality.
And it's got to be helping us do something God has asked us to do. Yeah. Yeah. Were you going to say something, Debbie?
I was thinking about when I was director of community corrections, I was using the operational funds to feed my board members. It made sense because they were too busy to stop and get something to bring it in for a board meeting. And so I was having it catered. And so my auditor came in and he said, there's nothing in the law that established your program that allows you to use your operating funds to feed your board. He said, if you want to do that, you're going to have to go back and have that added to your law.
Yeah.
And he said, then you can do it. Then you will have the authority to do it.
Yes.
That's what we're talking about.
And yeah, and I will say that about the bus thing, because whenever I've heard people talk about it, it's used in an evangelistic way. Is the purpose of our public gathering evangelism? No, it's not. It's to build up people who are already Christians. Now, the Bible does say in 1 Corinthians 14, if there's an unbeliever that comes among you and they hear somebody like preaching the word and it affects their heart and all that kind of stuff, then that could be something that could help people become a Christian, sure. But the public assembly is not for evangelism. And it doesn't mean a non-Christian can't come. It doesn't mean you've done something wrong if you've invited a non-Christian. That's not my point. But the main function of what we do when we come together is to build up Christians to go out and be lights in the world. So let's ask this other controversial question. Many people will suggest that if the Treasury were used to help non-Christians, we could, as a local church, encourage more people in the community to visit us. What would be wrong with this approach to using the Treasury? You know, if we can get more people in the doors, like if we go and let everybody know that, you know, West End is just the greatest church, and here's a really nice donut, and, you know, we'll fix your car and all that sort of thing. Like, hey, come on, like, come and visit us now. Wouldn't that really be helpful to us, Madeline? I'm sorry, Mallory.
I knew you'd have. Well, we don't have the examples we read was the Treasury being used when it was helping people, it was helping Christians.
Yes.
Not non-Christians. And I think the best way to show people that we are good Christians is for us individually to go help someone with their car.
Yes.
Help someone that's in need. If I individually do that, and then they find out I go to church somewhere, and then they meet one of my friends that goes to church with me or worships with me, they're going to go, those people are really nice. I'm going to go see what
Yeah.
they're all about. I think that's a bigger impact than the church doing it.
Yeah, is there anything wrong, let's say, with 5 of us? Let's say that there's some non-Christian guy that lives in Bowling Green. He's come into some hard times, and 5 of us collect $800 for the guy. Is there any problem with that? No. Right. But the Treasury, like the collected funds, have a specific purpose. Wes?
Jesus rebuked the crowds when they followed him for food. He said, you're seeking the food, you're not seeking the meat. And if you're going to entice somebody with a physical item, whatever it is, the spiritual aspect of what you're trying to offer them is not going to help. And when Paul comes to the lame beggar, Peter comes to the lame beggar in Acts 3, it says, gold and silver I do not have, but I do have is a gift.
Right.
Rise to walk. And so we are getting like a blind, we're getting free the captives of this world, and it's not through physical means. And so if we sell that first off, we're really diluting the gospel.
Right. Yeah, it's like some people have said that if you convert people with pizza, what do you have to keep giving them? Pizza. And it's got to get better and better, too. Amy? Yes. It's manipulative.
Yes, it's very manipulative. You're trying to buy people to get them to come. Let me give you something that you want, which is
And now I'll guilt trip you into a Bible study. Yeah, like we teach the gospel, and that's what draws people.
and so you use that
Yes.
God's word that changes
Right. And those would be some like practical considerations, but is there any time in the Bible where any churches were collecting a bunch of money together to give to non-Christians? Is that ever in the New Testament? It's not in the New Testament. And so we got to draw those lines. That obviously doesn't mean that we don't love non-Christians. It doesn't mean that individuals can't pool some money together. In fact, there's a guy that I get lunch with every Wednesday in town here that I knew when I lived in Nashville. And it was I think it was 5 of you that helped collect $800 for him when he was in a very bad financial situation. So, yeah. Oh, sorry, yeah.
I think it also kind of affects, or more important, address it is like, where's your heart at where you're thinking we should use the treasury for that? It's kind of the same aspect of if your mom or someone asks you to do something to help them with something and you're like, well, how much are you paying me for it? Because our evangelism is a service to God. So if you're asking for some kind of financial help to do that for you, it's like you're asking for payment in exchange for something that you've done.
Yeah, good. Ian?
I have a question then. If a Christian needed funds from the Treasury, and those funds were going to be used to help a non-Christian, is that allowed?
So, like, in other words, I got a friend that needs aid.
As a middleman, if you act as a middleman, if a Christian were to act as a middleman.
No, I think it's got to be helping that individual Christian that's in need. That's the pattern that we have in the Bible. So, like, in other words, if I had a friend that was $800 short of something.
No, so let me put it this way. You have a family member in the hospital. They are a non-Christian. You don't have the funds to cover that. You go to the church to ask for help as you are in need to help a family member of yours. But that family member is not Christian. Are you allowed to ask help for that?
I think, yeah.
I understand the individual part, but I'm talking from the Treasury.
I don't think from the Treasury that would be okay, but I think I've seen individual Christians raise $20,000 to help a non-Christian.
Right, and we are called in the Bible to help those.
Right. So I would say if there's question about whether or not the Treasury should be used for this, just have individual Christians do it. Was there a follow-up to that, though? Okay, all right. Was there any? Yeah, over here.
It's all well and good we here in the United States and we're fat and sassy. But in the third world countries, it might be that you couldn't get to worship without somebody giving you a ride or something. And that's some gas money needs to be happening
Yeah.
somewhere.
Yeah.
So sometimes church do that like we will pay people here to clean the building that's not members of the church. So we got to think this thing through and be fair across the board.
Yeah. What would even constitute a needy Christian? When do you have somebody that's in need? Like, you know, their car broke down, they need $1,700 to fix it, or they need a new, you know, whatever. I think situations like that. By the way, this church is so good at not even having to use the treasury that, like, we maybe should use it more for needy Christians, because you guys collect money like lightning speed when there's somebody that's in need without even going to the treasury, which is a very commendable thing about this group. But anyways, anything else you guys want to say? I thought I saw. Where? Huh? Yeah, you.
That's why we have elders.
Yes.
Who control these things, and they're usually ruled before they start to happen. So the elders are to be over the one flock.
Yep.
And they really are going out away from themselves if they go overboard with money or whatever.
Yeah.
Usually they don't have enough excess money to do that, even to support missions in their own faith.
Right.
So it's not a problem.
Right. The role of elders in deciding, as long as it's scriptural, how the money gets used. So, could we take our church treasury here and support a college, like a Christian college. Would that be okay to do that? By the way, that's where people, the term an institutional church is a church that takes its treasury money and supports institutions with it. And there's no example in the Bible of doing something like that. Bill Hall, Sewell Hall's brother, wrote a little book called Restudying the Issues of the 50s and 60s, and this was when churches were dividing in the 50s and 60s over how the church treasury was used. And he wrote that it was a difficult time. I don't know that I could in any way picture for you, if you didn't live then, just how difficult that time was. Back somewhere in the mid-50s, in the pages of the Gospel Advocate, a quarantine was called for against all those who preached the gospel who opposed any institutional setup. That was about the time I started preaching. Meetings were canceled, churches were divided, preachers were fired, families were divided in sentiment. It was such a difficult time. And so these are things that people have divided and fought over a lot. And it causes questions like, can a local church use their finances to support institutions? No, that's what they divided over. Can a local church engage in a sponsoring church arrangement? What does that even mean anymore? People don't even do that anymore, so that I know of. Can a local church build a fellowship hall and kitchen and host meals with the church treasury? These are some of the things that people were asking in the 50s and 60s that were causing people to divide. And so one of the ways that you could depict this is you've got individual Christians, and they're supporting orphan homes, colleges, foundations, fundraisers for different things like sacred selections. Can individual Christians put their money into whatever they believe in? Yes, there's nothing stopping you from doing that. And there's passages in the Bible that talk about that sort of thing. With regards to the question, can we have a fellowship hall and all this kind of stuff, what do you guys think about a fellowship hall? We got like a minute left. Yeah.
I think if the elders of the congregation and the deacons thought there was a need, if you had widows that needed to be serviced, I think each congregation can make that decision. So I wouldn't take a blanket.
Okay. Think about this part of the question. Can a local church build a fellowship hall and kitchen and host meals with the church treasury? Can we use the church treasury to feed people?
Yes.
What was that? Yeah, if they're in need of eating or something like, but just like as a social event sort of thing, if they're needy Christians, then you could do that. But then, like, should we be doing it at the building when Paul says you've got houses to eat and drink in? Even if you wanted to argue that it doesn't mean you couldn't eat at the place that they were meeting, if there's people that feel like conscientiously what Paul means there is that we should not use this place for social events like that because that's not the work of the church, then out of love, don't push it. But even at that, you could still make an argument we shouldn't be doing that because our work as a local church is not for social events like that. But can a church take its treasury money and give money to somebody that needs money for food? Absolutely. Like in Acts 6, you've got the needy widows that are having the daily distribution. Yeah.
But you also see that it's a daily distribution and then build a building to house
Right.
to feed them.
Right.
They took food to them.
Yes. Good. All right. Did you have a final thing? Is it going to be like a... Yeah, go for it. All right.
So, do you not think that, like, churches having fellowship hall would be okay even if, like, it was only used, like, not a lot, like, people were still having people into their homes, but it was still used for, like potlucks or something?
I think it would be too distracting from what our purpose is. And that we should be more engaged in hospitality by having people into our homes.
Well, I think that if we were still doing that, do you not think it'd be okay to have one?
I think it would be unwise. I don't think that it would fit within the purpose of why we're meeting together. Like when we're gathered for worship, it would not fit in the purpose of why God has asked us to meet together in this way. Drew?
So I guess would that depend on, like we were talking about, if the church treasury bought the building versus if like it was owned by somebody else kind of thing?
Yeah. Well, yeah. We're out of time, but yeah, in a sense, yeah, that would be part of it too. And I'll tell you a little story in just a second. So, all right, thanks, guys.